Okay, so ready to dive into some UFOs?
Always.
Or I guess we should say UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena.
Right. Got to be up to date with the terminology. Though everyone still knows them as UFOs, so.
Exactly. And we're going way beyond those blurry photos you've seen. We're going to get into some serious academic work on this. For this deep dive, we actually went back and listened to an interview with Dr. Michael Cohn, a philosopher of science.
Who also, by the way, founded the Society for UAP Studies.
Right. And their academic journal, Lumina.
He's doing the work.
Really interesting stuff. But before we get into his story, we should probably talk about why some scientists and academics are even taking UAPs seriously.
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to the evidence. And not even evidence that was meant to be collected. We're talking about, like, radar operators who are just doing their jobs, tracking planes, and suddenly they pick up something moving crazy fast, like unbelievably fast.
Stuff that just shouldn't be possible.
Exactly. And those kinds of stories, those unexpected encounters, they really make you wonder what's going on up there.
It's like they accidentally stumbled onto something huge.
Totally.
And that's actually kind of similar to how Dr. Cohn got involved in this whole UAP thing. So picture this. He's a philosophy professor recovering from COVID, and he comes across this podcast with a former NASA physicist.
Okay, so already I'm hooked. Former NASA physicist talking UAPs. That's not something you hear every day.
Right, so this physicist, he wasn't just speculating. He had done actual calculations based on what people were reporting, on radar data, specifically from those USS Nimitz encounters back in 2004.
Oh yeah, the Nimitz encounters. Those are like legendary in UAP circles.
Definitely. But for anyone who might not know, can you give us a quick rundown of what happened?
So basically you had all these Navy pilots, experienced pilots, who reported seeing this weird tic-tac shaped object. And this thing was moving in ways that just defied physics, hovering, accelerating at insane speeds, dropping thousands of feet in seconds.
And it wasn't just like one pilot seeing things, right? They had multiple witnesses and they had it on radar.
Exactly. And that's what really got to Dr. Cohn. Like, he was listening to this podcast, this physicist is laying out all the data, and he's like, hold on, something's not adding up here.
Yeah.
So he starts digging deeper, doing his own research, and he realizes there are only a few possibilities. Either these pilots, these trained professionals, are all lying, or their equipment was malfunctioning.
Or they actually saw something truly unusual.
Exactly. And the idea that something unexplainable might be happening up there, that's a lot more interesting to a philosopher of science than a mass hallucination or a technical glitch. So Dr. Cohn, he keeps researching. He starts thinking about UAPs in this really interesting way. He says they exist in this kind of in-between space.
In between? What does that even mean?
Right, it's a little abstract. He actually uses the word liminal, which anthropologists use to describe those rites of passage in some cultures, you know, like when someone's transitioning from childhood to adulthood. They're not one or the other, but in between.
Okay, I'm starting to see where he's going with this.
So UAPs, they're kind of like that. We look up and we think we see something familiar, maybe an aircraft of some kind, but then it does things that are completely alien to our understanding of physics, how things should move.
So we're talking about something that looks kind of familiar, but acts totally bizarre.
Exactly. And that's what makes them so fascinating and so frustrating to study.
So we've got these mind-blowing accounts from Navy pilots, a former NASA physicist crunching numbers, a philosophy professor going down a rabbit hole, and this idea of a liminal space between the known and the unknown. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. Yeah. And this is where Dr. Cohn's background as a philosopher of science really comes into play. He starts to see this need for a whole new approach to studying UAPs, something he actually calls UAP studies.
Not just lumping it in with astronomy or physics, but treating it as its own distinct field.
Exactly. He even goes on to found the Society for UAP Studies, with the goal of bringing together scientists, researchers, academics from all different disciplines.
To tackle this mystery from all angles, because if you think about it, it's not just about physics.
Right. You've got the human element, too. How do people perceive these encounters? What are the psychological and sociological factors at play?
It's like a giant puzzle, and you need all these different pieces to see the whole picture.
Exactly.
So Dr. Cohn isn't just advocating for more research on UAPs. He's saying we need to change the entire way we approach this subject.
Exactly. And he argues that it's not even necessarily about proving or disproving the existence of aliens.
It's bigger than that.
It's about looking at all this evidence, the radar data, the eyewitness accounts, even potential physical traces, and saying, okay, what can we learn from this? What does this tell us about our current understanding of the universe, about our place in it?
Because maybe, just maybe, there's something truly groundbreaking out there waiting to be discovered. But we'll never find it if we're not willing to look.
It's about approaching this whole thing with a sense of curiosity, sure, but also with some rigor.
Yeah.
Not just jumping to conclusions. Like, we see something weird in the sky and it's easy to just go, oh, it's just a plane, or it's probably a weather balloon. But Dr. Cohn would want us to slow down a little, look at the actual evidence and ask, what if it's something else? Something we haven't even considered.
So, being more open-minded, challenging our own assumptions about what we think we know, which I guess is where this whole idea of a multi-generational research program comes in, right?
Right.
What does that even mean? It sounds pretty intense, like scientists working on a project for decades and then passing it on like a torch to the next generation.
Yeah, that's actually a really good way to think about it. Dr. Cohn's point is that studying UAPs, if we're going to do it right, it takes a long-term commitment. It can't just be a few years here and there of funding and then it dries up.
Yeah.
He compares it to how scientists used to view the study of consciousness.
Which was not favorably.
Not at all. Too subjective, too mysterious, too many unknowns.
But then something changed, right?
Right. Researchers figured out ways to actually study consciousness scientifically, right? Measuring brain activity, mapping those neural pathways. And as they got deeper into it, they realized just how complex and fascinating it really is. And Dr. Cohn thinks the same thing could happen with UAPs, if we take it seriously, if we're willing to really dig in and be open to what we might find.
It's like that saying, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. Right? Like the universe is just full of these mysteries, and sometimes we need a whole new way of looking at things to even begin to understand them. But okay, I have to ask, how do you actually study something as unpredictable and, well, frankly, weird as UAPs? Like, what does that even look like in practice?
Well, he talks about this in the podcast, and it might be a little surprising. He says we need to shift our focus a bit. Instead of getting caught up in proving or disproving aliens, we should really be focusing on just understanding the phenomena themselves.
So less about, are UFOs real, and more about, okay, what are we actually seeing and what does that tell us?
Exactly. He uses the example of observing, collecting data, analyzing it, coming up with theories. The scientific method.
Right. Back to basics.
Exactly. And he even says that even if some, or even most, UAPs turn out to have totally normal explanations, the process of investigating them rigorously, that's still valuable.
Because it pushes us to expand our knowledge, to ask new questions.
And maybe even develop new technologies and ways of doing things. Yeah. He actually uses a really interesting analogy in the interview. He talks about how, for centuries, humans were totally obsessed with flying.
We looked at birds, right? Trying to figure out how they did it.
Exactly. We studied their wings, tried to copy their movements, all of that. But it wasn't until we actually discovered the principles of aerodynamics, the whole lift and drag thing, that we were able to build machines that could actually fly.
And even then, our first attempts were pretty basic compared to what we can do now.
Oh, for sure. Like night and day compared to the jets and supersonic aircraft we have now.
It's incredible.
It is. And imagine if we could get that close to a UAP. If we could study its propulsion system, figure out what it's made of, how it's controlled, who knows what kind of crazy technological advancements we could make.
It's like a glimpse into the future. Warp drives, zero-point energy, stuff that sounds like science fiction but could totally revolutionize everything.
And Dr. Cohn argues that this possibility, this potential, it's worth investing a lot more in UAP research. He points out that we're potentially talking about the biggest scientific discovery ever, and yet it's severely underfunded, often dismissed as fringe science.
Which seems kind of backwards.
Right. It makes you think, what if we dedicated even a fraction of the resources we put into other research areas into studying UAPs? Who knows what we could learn?
Right, and it's not like we're short on data, really.
Not at all. We've got decades worth of eyewitness reports, radar readings, photographs, even some videos out there. Now, granted, not all of it is going to be credible.
Right. Got to be discerning.
Absolutely. But there are some compelling cases, like those USS Nimitz encounters. You've got multiple credible witnesses, military-grade radar data. We even have that infrared video footage.
Hard to argue with that. And yet, for the most part, mainstream science still seems hesitant to really engage with this stuff. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's a few factors at play. There's definitely still a stigma attached to it, the whole association with science fiction, conspiracy theories, you name it.
It's like some people are afraid it'll ruin their reputation if they take it too seriously.
Exactly. And Dr. Cohn argues that this kind of self-censorship, it's actually really damaging. For science to advance, We have to be able to openly discuss and investigate these things without worrying about what other people will think.
Because what's more important? Protecting your reputation, or potentially making a huge scientific breakthrough. If there really is something strange happening in our skies, don't we have an obligation to at least try to understand it?
Absolutely, and that's where his idea of epistemic humility comes in.
Okay, hold on. We've got to unpack that one. Epistemic humility. It sounds very philosophical and a little intimidating.
It does sound complicated, right? But it's actually a pretty straightforward concept. It basically boils down to acknowledging that we don't know everything. Like, there might be things out there that we simply don't understand and maybe never will.
So you're saying even if we threw all of our resources, all the smartest people in the world at the UAP mystery, there's no guarantee we'd ever solve it completely?
Maybe not, but that's okay. Dr. Cohn compares it to quantum mechanics. Scientists have been studying that for a century, and some of it is still a total head-scratcher. We can make predictions, but the underlying reality, still a mystery.
It's true. Like, we have these incredibly precise equations for quantum phenomena, but the why behind it all, still elusive.
Exactly. And UAPs might be the same way. Maybe they operate on principles that are just so foreign to our current understanding of physics and technology that we'll never fully grasp them. Not in the traditional scientific sense, anyway.
Okay, so if we might never fully understand UAPs, even with all the research in the world, why bother at all? So if we might never have all the answers when it comes to UAPs, even with tons of research, why bother? Why even try?
It's a good question, and Dr. Cohn actually addresses it head-on in the podcast. He says, look, even if some things about UAPs stay mysterious, the journey of trying to figure them out, that's just as important as actually having all the answers.
Yeah.
Every question we ask, it's like, expands what we know and opens up even more questions.
It's like those old explorers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Setting out to explore a new land. They don't know what they'll find, but the exploring itself is what matters.
Exactly. And think about all the times in history when people believe things that we know now are totally wrong, like the earth being flat or diseases being caused by evil spirits. But we figured those things out by observing and questioning what we thought we knew. So who's to say we can't do the same with UAPs?
So what you're saying is, even if we never totally solve the UAP thing just by trying, we might make other discoveries, maybe even change the world.
Exactly. It could change how we see physics, astronomy, even our place in the universe. And it's not just about the science either. There's the whole philosophical side of it too. Like, what if we are not alone in the universe? That would make us rethink everything we thought we do about ourselves.
Right.
Our history, everything.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, but in a good way. It's exciting to think about all the possibilities. So for our listeners, for anyone who wants to learn more about UAPs, what should they do? Where do they go from here?
Well, Dr. Cohn, he actually gives some pretty good advice at the end of the podcast. He says to be curious, definitely, but also to be a little skeptical. Don't believe everything you hear. Do your own research, ask questions, and be open-minded to the idea that there might be more to this whole thing than we can even imagine right now.
Don't just go down the rabbit hole without, checking to see where it leads first, right?
Right. And he mentions that the Society for UAP Studies and their journal, Limina, those are really great places to start if you want to learn more about the actual research that's being done.
It's peer-reviewed, right? So it's legit.
Exactly. And they're building a community of people who are all working on this together, which is really cool.
And don't forget about all the stories out there. Like Dr. Cohn talked about how UAPs have been a part of our culture for a long time. We see it in movies, TV, even just stories people tell each other.
Totally. And he says it's good to think about those stories, not as proof of anything, but as a way of exploring our own hopes and fears about the unknown. Because when you get right down to it, UAPs, they're about more than just data and science, They're about our relationship with the universe and all the big questions we have about our place in it.
It's a good reminder that there's still so much out there that we don't know, that the universe is full of, wonders and mysteries. And who knows, maybe some of those mysteries, maybe they really are stranger than fiction. So stay curious, everyone. Keep asking those what-if questions, because as we've learned from this deep dive on UAPs, those what-ifs, they can lead to some pretty amazing places.